The HOA president stood on my dock, clipboard in hand, announcing a fishing tournament on my lake. "Community property now," he smirked. I stepped forward. "I own this lake." He laughed like he'd already won. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't about rules. It was a takeover. Want to know how I turned the tables? Subscribe to the channel and press the bell icon so you don't miss what happened next. The morning mist curled low over Sullivan Lake, clinging to the water like it was reluctant to let go. I stood on the weathered dock, coffee mug warming my hand, and stared at the shape bobbing gently in the water, my old fishing boat. It had been there longer than some of the houses around the lake, and it wasn't going anywhere. Or so I thought. The email from the Maple Creek Estates Homeowners Association had arrived 2 days earlier, the subject line reading in bold, self-important letters. Notice of violation. Unauthorized vessel docked on lake property. The arrogance of it was almost funny. Almost. The letter claimed my boat was unsightly and in violation of community aesthetic standards and demanded I remove it within 7 days. Failure to comply would result in fines and further legal action. I nearly spit out my coffee reading that last part. They were acting like they owned the lake. The truth was, my family had owned Sullivan Lake for 3 generations. My grandfather had bought it after returning from the war, vowing to keep it unspoiled. The property line didn't just reach the shoreline, it included the entire body of water and much of the surrounding woods. I had the deeds and maps to prove it. I'd been content to keep to myself, letting the HOA run their fishing club and weekend regattas without interference, as long as they didn't damage the environment. But this was different. This was them telling me what to do with my own property. It wasn't going to stand. I decided to respond in person. HOA meetings were usually held in their little community center, a squat brick building that looked like it had been designed to be unwelcoming. I walked in during their Tuesday evening gathering, wearing my work boots, flannel shirt, and a smile that said I was about to ruin someone's day. The chatter died down the moment I stepped through the door. At the head of the table sat Karen Mitchell, the HOA president. Her hair was shellacked into place, her blazer pressed within an inch of its life. To her right was Gerald Thompson, head of the fishing club and perpetual scowler. "Mr. Sullivan," Karen said, her voice tight, "we weren't expecting you." "I'm sure," I replied, taking a seat without being offered one. "I came to talk about your little letter." Her expression flickered just for a second before she regained her composure. "We have community standards, and your vessel—" "My vessel," I interrupted, "is on my lake." I let the word "my" hang in the air like a storm cloud. "That lake is part of Maple Creek Estates," Gerald snapped. "Our bylaws—" "Your bylaws," I cut in again, "stop at your property lines, which, for the record, do not include the lake. I own it, every drop of it, including the part your fishing club uses for its tournaments." Murmurs rippled through the room. Karen's lips thinned to a nearly invisible line. "We have long-standing arrangements for lake use," she said finally. "Arrangements I allowed out of courtesy," I said. "Not because you have any legal claim, but now that you're threatening fines and legal action over my boat, I'm rethinking that courtesy." The silence that followed was delicious. Karen tried to regroup, but I could see the calculation in her eyes. She wasn't used to being challenged, certainly not with facts. "We can discuss this," she said at last, though her tone suggested she wasn't used to backing down. "I'm sure we can," I said, standing. "But here's what's going to happen in the meantime. You're going to rescind your violation notice, and you're going to tell your fishing club they no longer have permission to use the lake until further notice." Gasps filled the room. Gerald looked like he might choke on his own indignation. "You can't—" "I can," I said, eating for the door. "And I just did?" By the time I got home, I could already imagine the flurry of angry phone calls flying between HOA members. Let them stew. They'd started this fight, but they had no idea just how badly they'd misjudged their opponent. The lake wasn't just mine. It was part of my family's history, and I wasn't about to let a bunch of overreaching busybodies take it from me. The next morning, I woke to the sound of tires crunching on gravel. From my front porch, I saw a black SUV pull up near the dock. Out stepped Gerald Thompson, looking like a man ready for war. He was wearing his fishing club jacket, The embroidered logo on the breast puffed out like a badge of authority. In his hand was a clipboard, because of course it was. "You can't just cancel our tournament," he barked before I could even say good morning. "We've got sponsors lined up, prizes bought, the whole community counting on it." I leaned against the porch railing and sipped my coffee. "Not my problem, Gerald. This lake is our main attraction," he pressed on. "People move here for the fishing." "Then maybe you should have thought about that before trying to tell me what I can dock on my own water," I said, my voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the morning air. His face flushed. "The boat is an eyesore. We have standards." "You have opinions," I corrected, "and a bad habit of pretending they're laws." That earned me a glare so intense it could have boiled the lake. "You're making a big mistake," he warned. "The HOA doesn't take kindly to troublemakers." I stepped down from the porch, closing the space between us until we were just a couple of feet apart. "Gerald, I'm not the troublemaker here. You and your friends came after me, and you picked the wrong man." He faltered, but only for a moment. "We'll see about that," he muttered, before stomping back to his SUV and tearing off down the road. I watched him go, feeling the first stirrings of the storm I knew was coming. The HOA wouldn't just roll over and let me block them from the lake. They'd fight, probably dirty, and I had no doubt they'd try to spin the whole thing to make me the villain. Sure enough, by that afternoon, I started getting calls from a few neighbors I barely knew. One woman told me she'd heard I was selfishly closing off the lake to punish the whole community. Another man said Karen Mitchell had emailed everyone claiming I was threatening legal action against any resident who set foot in the water. The lies were spreading faster than I could counter them. That night, I dug out the thick, leather-bound binder my grandfather had kept, a complete history of Sullivan Lake's ownership, including the original purchase deed from 1947, maps, and every renewal of title. If the HOA wanted to fight, I'd come armed with more than just words. I also made a call to someone I trusted, Emma Reynolds, a property lawyer I'd gone to high school with. She'd been a sharp debater back then, and she was even sharper now. When I told her what was going on, she didn't hesitate. "They're bluffing," she said, "but bluffs work when nobody calls them out. Send me scans of everything you have, and I'll draft a formal cease and desist. We'll make it clear they're trespassing and liable if they keep using the lake without permission." Her confidence was contagious. I spent the rest of the night scanning documents and emailing them over. When I finally shut down the computer, I looked out at the moonlit water. The lake was still, serene, as if unaware of the battle brewing around it. But I knew better. This wasn't just about a boat anymore. This was about power, and the HOA wasn't going to let go quietly. 2 days later, Emma's cease and desist letter landed in the inboxes of every HOA board member, including Karen Mitchell. I imagined her reaction, that tight-lipped smile she wore when she thought she still had the upper hand, the way her eyes narrowed just slightly when she realized she didn't. I didn't have to imagine for long. She showed up in person. It was late morning, and I was repairing a loose board on the dock when her white sedan rolled up. She stepped out, dressed like she was attending a country club brunch. Pressed slacks, pastel sweater draped over her shoulders, oversized sunglasses. "Mr. Sullivan," she greeted, voice dripping with that faux politeness that always preceded a threat. "Karen," I replied without looking up from my work. "I received your letter." I drove the nail in with one last satisfying strike before setting the hammer down. "Good. Saves me the trouble of wondering if you read it." Her smile twitched. "You do understand that this lake is central to our community, don't you? People have enjoyed access for years. Your sudden hostility—" I stood, meeting her gaze. "Hostility? That's rich, coming from the woman who tried to tell me what I could park on my own dock." She waved a manicured hand dismissively. "The boat issue is irrelevant now. What matters is maintaining harmony. If you insist on enforcing this private ownership nonsense, you'll fracture the neighborhood." "Private ownership nonsense?" I stepped closer. "Karen, I own the deed. I have maps, titles, and 70 years of tax receipts to prove it. The only nonsense here is you acting like this lake belongs to you." Her tone hardened. "If you persist, the board will be forced to take legal action." I smiled. "By all means. I look forward to seeing you explain to a judge why you've been collecting lake maintenance fees for property you don't own." That shut her up for. for half a second, long enough for me to see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, but she recovered quickly. "You'll regret this," she said, turning on her heel and stalking back to her car. After she left, I called Emma to relay the exchange. "Classic bully tactics," she said. "They want you scared. Don't be. In fact, let's push back harder. I'll file a notice with the county clerk's office clarifying your ownership. Once that's on public record, it'll make their position even weaker." The next week was a quiet before the storm. I went about my routine, fishing in the mornings, maintaining the cabin, talking to a few friendly neighbors who'd come by to offer quiet support. But tension was thick in the air. You could feel it in the way some residents avoided eye contact when they drove past, or how conversations stopped when I walked into the general store. Then came the move I'd been expecting. The HOA sent a formal notice of violation, accusing me of obstructing community use of shared amenities and demanding I remove obstructions from the lake. They gave me 7 days to comply or face fines. It was laughable, but also dangerous. If I ignored it, they'd use my silence as ammunition. If I engaged without strategy, they'd twist my words. So, I let Emma handle it. She drafted a blistering response citing chapter and verse of property law, attaching copies of the original deed, and politely suggesting the HOA cease their fraudulent claims before we pursued damages. By the time the letter hit their mailbox, I knew this wasn't just going to be a neighborhood dispute anymore. This was going to blow up in ways Karen and her cronies couldn't possibly predict. The escalation came faster than I thought. 2 mornings after Emma's rebuttal went out, I woke to the sound of voices outside. Not the friendly banter of early fishermen. This was louder, sharper, laced with the authority of people who thought they were in control. When I stepped onto the porch, I saw them. 3 men in dark jackets emblazoned with HOA Security in bold white letters. They were clustered at the end of my dock, pointing at my boat as if they'd just discovered contraband. One of them, tall, thin, and radiating smugness, turned toward me. "Sir, you're in violation of Maple Creek Estates regulations. This vessel is being impounded." I blinked at them. "Impounded? By who?" "By the Homeowners Association," he replied, chest puffed, "as per Article 12, Section 4 of the Community Bylaws." I walked down the dock slowly, more curious than angry. "That's interesting," I said, "because Article 12, Section 4 has no jurisdiction here. This lake isn't community property." The short, stocky one with a buzz cut snorted. "That's not what we've been told." "Then you've been lied to," I said plainly, "and I suggest you walk away before you trespass any further." Tall and smug smirked. "Sir, we've been authorized to remove the boat. Step aside." I looked past them toward the shoreline and noticed a small knot of residents gathered, watching from the edge of the park area. Among them, Karen Mitchell stood with her arms crossed, sunglasses hiding her eyes, but not her satisfaction. I pulled my phone from my pocket. "Here's how this is going to work. You're going to leave, now, or I'm going to call the county sheriff and report an attempted theft and criminal trespass. And just so you know, I'm recording this conversation." Buzzcut shifted uncomfortably, but Smug kept his grin. "You're making a mistake, Mr. Sullivan." I stepped closer, my voice low but firm. "No, the mistake is thinking fake badges and a title from the HOA give you authority over my property." After a tense pause, Smug muttered something under his breath and motioned to the others. They turned and walked back toward the park, deliberately slow, as if retreating on their own terms. Karen followed, her lips pressed tight in a thin line. Emma laughed when I called to tell her. "Fake HOA police? That's almost too good to be true. We'll add it to the evidence file. They're digging themselves a deeper hole every time they try something like this." But even as I hung up, I knew they wouldn't stop. Karen and her allies had already crossed a line. They'd try again, and next time, they might not just come for the boat. The days following the HOA security incident were deceptively calm, like the heavy silence before a storm. I used that time to prepare, gathering every scrap of paperwork, maps, deeds, and correspondence I had about the lake. I even dug out my grandfather's old leather-bound notebook where he'd sketched the boundaries and water rights agreements going back to the 1960s. If Karen Mitchell wanted a fight, she was going to learn I came armed with more than just a stubborn streak and a weathered fishing boat. Emma was my constant lifeline through all of this. Every morning we'd have a call over coffee, Me on the cabin porch overlooking Sullivan Lake, her in her bustling downtown office, already in lawyer mode by 8 a.m. sharp. Their entire premise, she explained, is based on a falsehood, that the lake is either public or community property. Once we prove definitively that it's privately owned, they lose all leverage. But Karen isn't just after the lake for fun. She's got a development agenda, and if I know people like her, she's already promised someone else a piece of what she doesn't own. That thought gnawed at me. The HOA's fishing club was one thing, but turning the Eastern Shore into a gated marina or lakeside condos was another. My grandfather had fought tooth and nail to prevent overdevelopment. He understood that the lake's charm and its ecosystem couldn't survive bulldozers and boardwalks. 2 evenings later, my suspicion was confirmed. I was pulling my boat up onto the dock when Ray Delgado, an old friend of my grandfather's, wandered over from his place up the hill. Ray was the sort of man who knew everything before the newspaper did, and the look on his face told me he had something worth hearing. "You didn't hear this from me," he said, lowering his voice. "But there's talk in town. Karen's been meeting with a guy named Richard Wilkins, supposedly a real estate developer from down south. Word is, they're pitching the HOA on selling exclusive access rights to the lake to fund a luxury resort on the Eastern Shore." I froze, one hand still gripping the boat's bow rope. "Exclusive access rights? That's my property they're talking about." Ray shrugged. "And she's telling people the HOA already has it under control. Saw her at the diner last week with Wilkins, slick-looking guy in a tailored suit, all smiles, the kind of smile that's hiding something." I thanked Ray and went inside, the air in the cabin suddenly feeling heavy. I poured myself a drink and sat at the kitchen table, the lake's reflection shimmering through the window. If they were this far along, meeting with developers, planting the idea in residents' heads, it meant they'd already started building a narrative where I was the villain, the stubborn landowner holding up progress. Emma didn't sound surprised when I relayed the news. "It fits. They're trying to box you in, make you look unreasonable, so when they announce the deal, the community is already on their side. But if this Wilkins is who I think he is, we might have an angle. Give me a day or two to dig." I didn't have to wait long for the next move. The following Saturday, a letter arrived in my mailbox, not certified but printed on Maple Creek Estates HOA letterhead. It was addressed to lakefront stakeholders and read like a glossy sales pitch. Maple Creek Estates is excited to announce a potential partnership with Wilkins Development Group to revitalize and enhance our beautiful lakeshore. Plans include upgraded facilities, expanded recreational options, and exclusive amenities for members. As part of this initiative, the HOA will be acquiring necessary rights to the eastern and northern shores of the lake to ensure unified management and maintenance. The letter went on to explain that stakeholders would be contacted individually to formalize agreements and align on community benefits. They hadn't contacted me yet, probably saving me for last or hoping I'd cave after hearing everyone else was on board. I walked out onto the dock with the letter in my hand, the water lapping softly against the pilings. My grandfather's old plaque hung on the cabin wall inside, with his favorite saying, "Water is life, not a commodity to be bought and sold." I traced the embossed letters in my mind and felt something settle deep in my chest. Karen Mitchell and Richard Wilkins thought they were playing a game of persuasion and politics, but this wasn't a game to me. This was my home, my history, and my responsibility. If they wanted a fight for Sullivan Lake, I was ready to give them one, and I wouldn't just play defense. They'd made their opening move. Now it was my turn. I didn't have to wait long to make my countermove. That Monday, I paid a visit to the county records office, a beige concrete building that smelled faintly of paper and mildew. The clerk behind the counter, an older woman named Diane, remembered my grandfather well. "Sullivan Lake," she said with a faint smile, flipping through the ledger. "Your family's had clear title on that since before I started working here, and that was 37 years ago." I asked her to pull every document, every plat map, every water rights certificate tied to the property. Within 20 minutes, I had a thick manila folder stuffed with photocopies and certified seals. Not only did my grandfather own the land beneath the lake, but the water rights were spelled out in such unambiguous language that even the most creative HOA lawyer would have trouble twisting them. Still, I wasn't naive. People like Karen and Wilkins didn't back off just because of paperwork. They'd try to challenge it, delay, and pressure me into an amicable resolution that left me with less than I started with. So I decided it was time to play a little offense. Emma had been doing her own digging. When I called her that evening, she sounded downright pleased. "You'll like this," she said. "Richard Wilkins has a history. He was part of a failed marina development in South Carolina. Promised the local HOA a windfall, took in hundreds of thousands in improvement fees, and then the project collapsed when the landowners sued over fraud. Never faced criminal charges, but plenty of people lost money." That little nugget was gold. If the residents of Maple Creek Estates were putting their faith and possibly their wallets into Wilkins, they deserved to know who they were dealing with. I asked Emma how public the South Carolina case was. She chuckled. "Public enough that any reporter with half a brain can dig it up. Speak it's on. Among of which, have you talked to Sarah Lynn yet?" Sarah Lynn was a local newspaper journalist with a reputation for dismantling crooked HOA boards like a master watchmaker taking apart a clock. I'd met her once at a fishing expo years ago. When I called her, she agreed to meet the next morning at a small cafe in town, far enough from Maple Creek to avoid prying eyes. She was younger than I remembered, mid-30s, sharp-eyed, and with a notebook that looked like it had been through a dozen investigations. I told her the basics: the boat confiscation, the fishing club using my lake without permission, the sudden push for a unified management agreement. When I mentioned the rumored resort development, she sat up straighter. "I've been hearing whispers about that for months," she said, "but nobody's gone on record. If they're planning to build on private property they don't own, that's a front-page story." I asked her to hold off publishing for now. "I'm not ready to go public until I know exactly what they're planning, but I want you to be ready." She agreed, promising to keep an ear to the ground and feed me anything she learned. That night, I sat on the porch watching the moon ripple across the lake. Somewhere out there, Karen and Wilkins were counting on my silence, or my surrender. They were in for a rude awakening. The very next day, my doorbell rang. Standing there was none other than Richard Wilkins himself, minus the tailored suit. He wore a casual button-down, sleeves rolled, the look of a man trying hard to appear approachable. "Mr. Sullivan," he began with a practiced smile, "I think we got off on the wrong foot. I'm sure we can work something out." I let him in, curious to see where this was going. He admired the cabin with the kind of polite condescension city men reserve for anything rustic, then settled onto my couch. "The HOA is willing to make an exception for your boat," he said. "You can keep it here, no problem. All we ask is you sign a simple agreement acknowledging the HOA's management role over lake activities." He handed me a document. It was essentially a surrender note in disguise, recognizing the HOA's authority over my lake in exchange for a temporary olive branch. I flipped through it, biting back a laugh. "And what about the fishing tournament tomorrow?" I asked casually. "Would that be covered too?" His smile tightened. "You know about that?" "Gerald Thompson invited me," I said with a shrug. "Sounds like a big event." "It's a tradition," he said slowly, but his eyes were calculating now. When I asked about the resort development, he feigned ignorance, waving his hand as if it were nothing, but I could see it in the way his jaw tightened. He knew exactly what I was talking about. I handed the agreement back. "My lawyer will need to review this." His pleasant mask slipped for just a second. "It would be in everyone's best interest if we resolved this amicably. There are opportunities that could benefit you too if you're willing to be cooperative." There it was, the thinly veiled bribe. I didn't blink. "I'll think about it. In the meantime, I'd appreciate the return of my boat." He stood, clearly displeased. "The HOA has been managing this lake for years, Mr. Sullivan. It would be unfortunate if this turned into a prolonged dispute." I held his gaze. "Unfortunate for who?" When he left, I called Emma. "He practically admitted they have no legal claim," I told her. "And he hinted at cutting me in on the deal." She wasn't surprised. Classic playbook. "Tomorrow at the tournament, we document everything. No interference, just gather evidence. The real fun comes afterward." The morning of the fishing tournament dawned with a sky streaked pink and gold, the kind of serene summer sunrise that begged for quiet reflection. But there was nothing quiet about Maple Creek Estates that day. By the time Emma and I arrived at the public side of the lake, the one patch of shoreline technically accessible to non-residents, the HOA's fishing club was already setting up like they owned the place. Pop-up tents lined the water's edge, Folding tables groaned under the weight of coolers, and a large banner flapped in the breeze, Maple Creek Annual Bass Invitational. They hadn't bothered to mention, by permission of the owner, anywhere on that sign. Emma adjusted the strap of her camera bag and smirked. This is perfect. They're documenting their own trespass for us. We'd come prepared. She had her DSLR and a telephoto lens, and I had my phone ready to record video, complete with a timestamp and GPS metadata. We positioned ourselves where we could see the lake clearly without stepping onto HOA-maintained property. I wasn't about to give them an excuse to accuse me of trespassing. The first boats pushed off just after 7. Shiny fiberglass bass boats with mounted motors zipped toward the deeper water, followed by smaller aluminum craft, and even a few kayaks. I recognized Gerald Thompson in one of the bigger boats, wearing a fishing vest covered in sponsor patches. He didn't see us, too focused on navigating the narrow channel near my dock. A dock that, according to the paperwork in my possession, sat entirely on my property. It was one thing to hear about them using the lake without permission. It was another to watch boat after boat launch from a dock they had no right to touch. Each time one crossed that invisible line into my legal territory, Emma's camera clicked like a metronome. Around mid-morning, Richard Wilkins arrived. He wasn't fishing. He was holding court. Dressed in a Maple Creek polo shirt and mirrored sunglasses, he moved from group to group, shaking hands, slapping backs, and generally acting like the lord of the manor. I caught snippets of conversation floating over the water, talk of exciting opportunities, boosting property values, and exclusive access. Emma nudged me. He's priming them for the resort pitch. You can see it in his body language. I agreed. This wasn't just about a fishing tournament, it was a stage for his sales pitch. If the residents got hooked on the idea of some big, shiny development, they'd happily sign away whatever rights Wilkins asked for, including the ones they didn't actually have. By noon, the weigh-in station was bustling. Emma and I strolled closer, careful to stay on public ground. The biggest bass of the day so far weighed just over 6 pounds, and the crowd erupted in cheers when the number was called. It would have been a wholesome small-town moment if it wasn't unfolding on stolen access. That's when Sarah Lynn appeared. She gave me a small nod, notebook already in hand. "I figured you might be here," she said under her breath. "This is bigger than I thought. They're using your property for the main event." "Wait until you see the footage," I replied. "They're not just fishing, they're promoting something. Wilkins is working the crowd hard." Sarah's pen moved fast, but her eyes kept scanning the scene. "I'll keep it quiet for now," she promised. "But if they announce anything concrete, I'm running it." We stayed another hour, watching the trophies handed out and the raffle prizes distributed. When the crowd started to thin, Wilkins stepped up to a portable PA system. His voice carried across the water. "Maple Creek Estates is entering an exciting new chapter," he said, pausing to let the applause settle. "We've been in talks with developers to bring a world-class lakeside resort to our community, a project that will enhance our quality of life and bring lasting value to every property here." My jaw tightened. There it was, out in the open. Emma was already filming. "Got him," she whispered. He went on about partnerships and exclusive membership tiers for residents, curfew, not to mention the little problem of ownership. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "Of course, we'll need to finalize certain agreements to make this possible." I knew exactly which agreements he meant, and I had no intention of signing them. As the crowd cheered, I made a quiet promise to myself. They wanted a fight, they were going to get one, and I was done playing defense. The parking lot was still half full when Emma and I slipped away from the tournament. We didn't want to risk anyone following us back to my cabin, so we took the long way around the lake, cutting through a stretch of county road lined with overgrown pines. Emma was practically buzzing. "That was gold," she said, holding up her camera like it was a trophy. "We have him admitting to development plans, doing it in front of dozens of residents and using your lake without permission. This is going to blow up in his face." I was less celebratory, more calculating. He's bold enough to say it publicly. That means he's confident he can make the ownership issue disappear. Or, Emma countered, he's bluffing, hoping you'll cave before anyone looks too closely. We reached the cabin, and I pulled the memory card from my phone's security system. The footage from that morning was almost comical. Boats idling past my dock, fishermen waving like we were all good friends, and Wilkins pacing near the weigh-in station with all the swagger of a political candidate. I copied the files to 2 external drives and locked them away. Emma set up her laptop at the dining table, connecting her camera and pulling up the high-resolution shots. Every frame was crisp, the unauthorized dock launches, the banners, the crowd, the exact moment Wilkins mentioned the resort. She labeled each image meticulously, time, location, subject, like we were building an evidence portfolio. You know, she said, glancing up for on the screen, we don't actually have to wait for them to push harder. We could go public now, put them on the defensive. I shook my head. Not yet. I want to know who's backing him. A project that size needs serious money, and it's not coming out of HOA dues. The next day, Sarah called. You were right, she said without preamble. I made a few calls, and a development company named Riverstone Partners has been sniffing around the county offices for permits. Guess who's listed as their community liaison? Wilkins, I said flatly. Bingo. And they're not just talking about a resort. They're drafting plans for a private marina, which, unless my geography's wrong, would sit right where your dock is. That was the missing piece. They weren't just trespassing for convenience. They were conditioning the community to see the lake as theirs, so when construction started, no one would question it. I thanked Sarah and hung up, my mind already shifting into another gear. If Riverstone Partners wanted a marina, they'd have to apply for water use rights, environmental impact studies, and shoreline modifications, all of which required my consent, which they weren't getting. That night, I walked down to the dock. The lake was still, the surface glassy under a rising moon. Somewhere across the water, a few late-night fishermen were laughing, their voices carrying over the water like ghosts. I stood there for a long time, thinking about my grandfather, who'd bought this land not for profit, but for peace. He'd taught me how to fish here, how to read the wind, how to respect the water. Selling out to people like Wilkins would have been a betrayal. When I finally went back inside, I told Emma, it's time to make them sweat. Her eyes lit up. What's the play? First, I said, we put them on notice, officially. No more friendly chats, no more pretending this is a misunderstanding. They're trespassing, they're promoting false ownership, and they're attempting to profit off private property. We'll hit them with certified letters, backed by every legal citation, Emma. I corrected myself with a grin. You can dig up. She was already reaching for her laptop. Oh, I can dig. I looked out the window one last time before bed. The lake was mine, and now it was war. The certified letters went out the next morning, one to Wilkins, one to the HOA board, and one to Riverstone Partners corporate office. Each was written in the driest, most formal legal tone Emma could muster, citing property statutes, riparian rights, and specific violations. We even attached high-resolution photographs of the trespassing incidents, complete with timestamps. There would be no plausible deniability left. By mid-afternoon, my phone started ringing. First, it was Karen Mitchell, the HOA president, sounding defensive but trying to play it off as a community misunderstanding. I cut her short. Karen, this isn't a misunderstanding. It's theft of my property rights, my dock, and my shoreline. You have 72 hours to remove any unauthorized structures and end all lake activities until further notice. If not, we'll move to civil court. She sputtered something about residents' expectations before hanging up. 2 hours later, Wilkins himself called. His voice was smooth at first, all charm and faux concern. I think we can work this out like civilized people, he said. No need for lawyers or courts. You've got a beautiful lake, and we have a community eager to enjoy it. Why not come to an arrangement that benefits everyone? You mean an arrangement that benefits you, I said. You've been selling access you don't own, negotiating development deals without my consent, and using my shoreline as your personal marketing tool. The arrangement is simple. You stop immediately, or you'll be in court before the week's over. The charm slipped. You're making a big mistake, he snapped. You think you can take on an entire HOA and a developer? You'll run out of money before I do. I don't need more money, I said evenly. I have the law, the deed, and every shred of evidence to prove what you're doing, and I have no problem letting the press know exactly how you operate. The line went dead. That night, Sarah published her first article. The headline alone made me smile. HOA, developer accused of trespassing, fraud in Sullivan Lake dispute. She included photos of my dock swarming with unauthorized fishermen, Wilkins at the tournament podium, and excerpts from public records showing my ownership. The response was immediate. My phone lit up with messages from residents, some apologetic, others furious at the HOA leadership for misleading them. The county commissioner's office called, requesting a meeting. By the next day, the sheriff's department had a patrol car circling the lake. Riverstone Partners issued a curt statement claiming they had paused all negotiations pending a review of property boundaries. Translation: they were backing away before the bad press burned them. Wilkins, however, wasn't done. 2 nights later, I caught sight of a flashlight beam near the eastern shore. I grabbed my own light and a camera, slipping quietly down to the waterline. There he was, Wilkins himself, pulling survey stakes out of the ground like he was trying to erase evidence. I stepped out of the shadows. "You know tampering with survey markers is a criminal offense, right?" He froze, then straightened with a sneer. "No one's going to believe you. You're just some stubborn guy with a boat and a grudge." "Maybe," I said, holding up my phone, "but now I'm a stubborn guy with a video." He cursed under his breath and stormed off into the trees. The next morning, I sent the footage to the county prosecutor. Within days, an investigation into the HOA's finances and Wilkins's dealings was underway. What they found unraveled fast: misappropriated maintenance funds, inflated invoices, and a paper trail showing Wilkins taking consulting fees from the HOA while also pitching the lake development to Riverstone. Karen Mitchell signed under pressure. Half the board followed suit. The rest voted to dissolve the fishing club until the legal dust settled. 3 weeks later, Wilkins vanished, packed up his things in the middle of the night and left town without a forwarding address. Riverstone formally withdrew their proposal. In the quiet that followed, I met with a group of residents, people who genuinely cared about the lake. One of them, an older gentleman named Michael Davis, told me how my grandfather had once let him fish from the dock as a boy. "He said the lake belonged to those who respected it," Davis said. "Seems to me you're carrying that on." We formed the Sullivan Lake Conservation Trust, a nonprofit to manage controlled public access while preserving the ecosystem. Annual permits replaced arbitrary HOA fees, and every dollar went into conservation. The reformed fishing club returned, this time open to anyone willing to follow the rules. On the day we opened the new lakeside park, I stood on the dock with a plaque in hand, engraved with my grandfather's words: "Water is life, not a commodity to be bought and sold." I hung it on the pier, the same place he used to tie up his boat. Mine sat nearby, weathered, patched, but still floating. I'd thought about replacing it once, but decided against it. Some things, like the lake, don't need to be shiny to be worth protecting. As the sun dipped low, families fished along the shore. Kids laughed in the shallows, and a heron skimmed the surface before landing in the reeds. The lake was still mine, but now it was also theirs, shared, respected, and safe from greedy hands. Wilkins's grand plan for luxury condos had crumbled into a cautionary tale. And me? I was content knowing that standing my ground hadn't just saved my property. It had preserved something far more valuable. Just before heading inside, I took the boat out to the middle of the lake, coffee in hand. The water was calm, the sky streaked in gold. Somewhere, my grandfather was smiling.